This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to Beyond the Big Screen. I'm your host, Steve. I'm joined by Frank and Mustache Chris. We're all friends of ours. On today's episode, we have something of a special episode where we're going to be discussing what we consider to be the best and the worst remakes. On today's show, we're going to dive into this. I think that remakes are they can be the very best, or they can just destroy what's a really great concept. I think maybe we can talk a little bit about remakes just to get started. And we'll start with you, Frank. What do you look for in a good remake?
I look for it to capture what was special at the heart of the original, the story and the character, and then I look for it to be kind of redone in a way that maybe is updated for the time that the reboot or the remake is happening in. Not a shot for shot like Psycho was or whatever. You know, that really doesn't interest me, because why not just watch the original then? But the idea that you can take what was special about the movie, what really made the character shine, what was awesome and insightful about the story, and hang on to that, but then see it through the lens of the present. And so if they do that really well, it's the best remake. And if they do that really poorly, then it's one of the worst.
And I think that really captures it. Now, Mustache, in the notes, you were discussing a little bit of what differentiates a remake as such from a spinoff or a prequel or a sequel. So what's your sort of take on that?
We live in a day and age where it just seems like they're just remaking everything. Like what I look for in a remake is, I just want something like originality, right? Like not to the point where it's unrecognizable that you're remaking a film, but I want somebody who's going to bring something different to it, yet not totally destroy the original. And I don't know, it's interesting, like remakes, sequels, prequels, like sometimes it blurs a little bit, right? Like Evil Dead 2 is an example, which is like technically a sequel, but it's kind of basically a remake of the first movie, if that makes sense, right? That's my big thing, is like I just want something like that's it. You can watch it on its own, and they brought something different with it. And I think with like my choice of like best remake, I think they captured that perfectly. And then for my worst remake, Frank's already mentioned it, was Psycho.
Yeah, I can't really find anything to disagree. Like, capture some magic from that first one and then put your own spin on it. So in this episode where we're going to be talking about our favorite remakes, let's start and go right in with Chris. Make your case for what you think is the greatest remake of all time.
I'd say the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Marcus Nispel and written by Scott Koser. I just think that this remake did exactly what I had laid out earlier, where it kept certain aspects of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but changed in such a way, especially for like a modern audience, right? So it's got a very kind of 90s style of editing. They expand on the whole family aspect of it that was in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, the family's a big part, but you don't really get to know these people. In the 2003 remake, you get to know them a lot. In particular, R. Lee Ermey, who plays the sheriff in the film, and apparently it was the most fun he's ever had acting. the director just basically told him, it's like, you know what, buddy, just do you. And he just had a blast doing it. Like, like some of these scenes where he's like terrorizing these teenagers is just, he's so funny in it. And you're like kicking yourself for laughing because he's just such a dark, like disgusting, depressing character. And it's interesting with the 2003 remake because it was really well received, and it came, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but there was like a spew of like horror film remakes done by Platinum Dunes, which was like a Michael Bay company. They ended up redoing Friday the 13th, which was also really well done. They did Nightmare on Elm Street, which was, I liked the actor that played Freddy Krueger, but everything else about the film was not very, very good. That was almost on my list for worst remakes. Just the way it was shot, like you get the sense where, like, as dirty as the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre was, like, this film I think really does capture that aspect of it too. Like, there's just scenes with like rotting meat and like the hillbilly family that's like, you clearly tell there's like inbreeding going on. But for the most part, like, I would say it was E. Lee Ermey's performance in the 2003 remake that really like kicked it up a notch. Like, he really did add something to the story that wasn't in the original. And the guy that plays Leatherface, he was a professional wrestler. I'm trying to remember his name right now. He's just massive, and he's just like super intimidating. And in the 2003 one too, they upped up the gore. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, has this reputation as being like a really gory film, but when you go back and watch it, there's actually not that much gore in it. It's more kind of like just a lot of like screaming and just weirdness.
All right, that's really interesting. And so I'm going to jump in right now with my favorite remake and what I think is the best remake, and then we'll let Frank wind us up with our favorites. For me, it is the Death Wish from 2018. Now, the 1974 Death Wish, my theme is remaking the impossible movie to remake. And for me, Death Wish, the original 1974 movie, was, I would say, it's top 3 favorite movies. I think you got to kind of, in your mind, you've got to cut and not look at the 4 subsequent sequels to Death Wish to really appreciate the 1974 Death Wish. I mean, me personally, I did love all of the sequels, but, that's neither here nor there. I think if you look at the 1974 Death Wish, that stands by itself as, to me, it captures an age, and it wasn't cheesy, in my opinion, in any way. I think it told a really coherent story of the person, the New York City, the left-wing limousine liberal who's been mugged by reality. And that story of the person who has this sea change, it's a classic theme. The person who feels one way until he's been confronted by reality. And this, I think, shows the extremeness that you can go through it. The movie was based on a 1970s novel called Death Wish, by an author, Brian Garfield. And then he had a sequel to the novel called Death Sentence. If you put yourself, now, I wasn't born in that time period, I was born a little bit later, from that New York City of the early 1970s, but I listened to my in-laws who were living in New York City in that time, and it wasn't that far off of reality of how dangerous it was to live in New York City at that time period. And the original movie perfectly captured that. So when you go to remake it, like, how do you remake a movie that's so set in that particular time and place? Well, you have to look at those universal themes and metaphors that were tapped into in the original movie, and then find a time and a place where that works again. And the director and the producer, Eli Roth, set it in 2000 Chicago, where just crime is absolutely rampant. You have Bruce Willis, who is, I think Bruce Willis, I'm going to go out on a limb here and maybe I'll get savaged in the comments, but I think he's sort of the Charles Bronson of our age. And I mean that in the absolute best way possible. Eli Roth, he's the master of the really kind of crude violence, you might say, but I don't think the violence in this was crude at all. I think it captured the violence level of the original movie, and it maybe made it a little bit campy, but everything came through. The strong leading man who turns it around, who turns around his entire worldview, the strong man aspect of it, but it also brought in a little bit of fun and twisted it around a little bit. So I think that to me is what made the remake of the impossible remake, in my opinion, Death Wish of 1974 with Death Wish of 2018. And I should mention that there was another remake it was actually a sort of more of a remake of Death Sentence, not exactly a remake of Death Wish with Kevin Bacon, which was an absolute disaster. It didn't make my worst, but I would put that as my honorable mention of my worst. So I'll wrap it up there. And now we're going to lead in Frank, best remake.
A couple honorable mentions really quickly. I really wanted to say Heat is the best remake because it was basically a remake of LA Takedown, a TV movie. But I don't know that fit the spirit of the thing exactly. And we've already talked about Heat, so I'm gonna skip that. I was going to do Dune as well, and that's what both of you are probably expecting me to talk about, but I decided not to because I haven't had a chance to watch part 2. And I feel like it's only fair to have watched part 2 if I'm going to compare it to the William Hurt miniseries or the David Lynch directed film, because the Denis Villeneuve part 1 obviously only covered the first half of the story that the other 2 covered in its entirety. So I'm actually going with a movie that I haven't seen very many times. But I still think it's absolutely phenomenal remake, and that is True Grit, the 2010 version with Jeff Bridges. And that might seem a little sacrilegious because we're talking with John Wayne, in the original. But Westerns, and I know you love Westerns, Steve, Westerns, I think they kind of turned a corner in the 70s, and the corner that they turned was to be more lifelike, more realistic, and less fantastical. I mean, the Westerns from the 50s and early 60s and even back into the 30s and 40s, to me, were all very what am I trying to say here? More Narnia and less Game of Thrones, if that makes sense. And I really like the way that in the late 60s and early 70s up through today, they kind of turned into something a little bit more, gritty and realistic. Now, the original True Grit was like at the forefront of that. It was a little more so than some of the films that had, that preceded it, but it still had that Hays Code sort of feel to it, and it was still good. But then when the version with Jeff Bridges came out, I think he was more who they wanted John Wayne to be in the original movie. He was grimier. He was more broken down. He was more pathetic. He was more irascible, and he was more believable in all of those things. And then the Maddie, or whatever the girl's name was that hired him, she was so strident and strong, whereas she was a little bit shrill in the original. And then you just couple that with the advances in filmmaking and the way that it was shot in a much more realistic way. And I just think it's superior to the original in just about every way. I'm not a snake person. I don't care for snakes at all. So when she falls in that rattlesnake den and gets bit in the arm, I'm screaming like I'm screaming like more of a little girl than she was when she got bit. So But that's my choice is True Grit, and I stand by it.
So, guys, where should we start? Frank, since you went last, let's discuss your choice a little bit. I think I 100% agree with you in that transition between the sort of the more of the stage or the play version of the Western that got into something, I think, like Peck and Paw got to that. Some of the Sergio Leone stuff was starting to get into that. And I think the culmination was probably Unforgiven, where it sort of hit its peak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, The Outlaw Josie Wales, one of my favorite Westerns, and I think that definitely had it. And one thing I didn't mention, but I think it's a piece to it, is that they became much more morally gray and more willing to explore nuance. And in the 30s and 40s and 50s and clear into the early 60s, it seemed like the Western was essentially the white hat, black hat, or white man, red man, equation. And here's the good guys and here's the bad guys and here's the conflict. And guess what's going to happen? Oh, surprise. The good guys won. Then you get into these, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and suddenly we're rooting for the bad guys. And then Outlaw Josie Wales, he was a Confederate soldier, a Confederate bandit, basically. And he's wanted, he's an outlaw, but you kind of see his point, you're kind of rooting for him. And this trend continues, like you said, all the way up through Unforgiven, which is essentially Western noir, and just really well done. So I thought True Grit was, took the original story and the framework of it and the idea of it, which was actually, I think, trending that direction. Just the whole idea of the story, girl hires this guy for revenge. And, it just did it in spectacularly dark and nuanced fashion. So that's why I decided to pick it. You've seen it, haven't you, Chris?
I haven't watched a ton of Westerns, but the Sergio Leone, like spaghetti Westerns, are some of my favorite movies. Like Once Upon a Time in the West is probably top 5, top 10 favorite movie of mine, and that stars Charles Bronson. Good, Bad, and the Ugly, obviously, Fistful of Dollars. I love all those movies, but I don't think I've watched a ton of the older Westerns that you guys are talking about.
Well, the Outlaw Josie Wales is newer than those Sergio Leone ones that you're talking about. It's like 78 or so. It's a lot. It's got a lot of the same stuff going on. It's just arguably more story and character development, but still similar.
True Grit, if I'm not mistaken, was that was kind of like one of his last movies, right? The original ones, like one of his last Westerns. Yeah, because I remember people were saying it was like a different type of movie for the Duke. Like it was even the original, the tone was different than say like The Searchers or some of his earlier stuff.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. I think that's one fascinating thing about the Duke is that John Wayne, is that he gets kind of that pigeonhole that he's just this one-dimensional character and that's all he played. But he was involved in that transition to the more nuanced Western. I mean, so he was in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which that was a very nuanced movie, and that, it got into all these themes of the washed up gunslinger and who's really the good guy, who's really the bad guy. I thought one more while we're on yours, Frank. I wonder, what do you think of I think maybe it's the ultimate remake and it's the remake that probably of all of these bends the idea the most is the Seven Samurai to the Magnificent Seven. That one, I still can't wrap my mind around.
Real quickly before I answer that, he made this movie True Grit in 1969. And he made, it looks like, I'm not even counting here, but it looks like about a dozen more films after that, including the sequel, Rooster Cogburn, in 1975. And then The Shootist was his last film, where he actually had a starring role. That was in 1976. Ron Howard was in that. Yeah, I mean, I love The Seven Samurai. I love Kurosawa's films. And the original Magnificent Seven was an interesting take on that. And then they did just remake it. I did not watch the remake, and I probably should have. It had a good cast. Did you see it? Is it good?
It was one of those ones I had a really hard time getting into because it didn't have the cool factor. Even though there was a lot of really cool actors in it, they were maybe trying too hard, and they just didn't come across as how cool that original cast was, and how, you know, how their cool was effortless, where it seemed like they were trying to be cool in the remake, and it just didn't quite work for me.
I recently watched the Adam Sandler spoof on the Westerns. It's terrible, but there's some I just came to my head right now, and there was some funny bits in it, but like, yeah, like you have to be like a pretty big fan of Adam Sandler to enjoy that movie. Me and the wife were watching it a couple weeks ago, and it was god awful. I hope they never remake the Sergio Leone Western movies, but I have a feeling they will once Clint Eastwood kicks the bucket. No one's going to do it while Clint's still alive.
If we move on and we take a look at my choice of Death Wish, am I off base here? I feel that for me, maybe I'm too invested into Death Wish, and that's clouding my judgment a bit. But I just feel like maybe it's, if you're out there and you think, well, Death Wish, that's a rotten movie, and the remake was slightly better, so is that maybe the best remake? I think mine kind of hinges on, if you think that the 1974 version of Death Wish was terrible, it kind of blows up my whole argument.
Have you seen it, Chris? The remake?
I've seen both of them. Like the original I love. I thought the remake was well done too. It's interesting you brought up the Westerns, and like Death Wish, and there's like a transition. It goes from like kind of like the Western to like the cop / like vigilante, like in the 70s, right? Like
it's an urban Western almost.
Yeah, like Clint Eastwood starts doing the Dirty Harry series, and then there was like the Death Wish movies, and like Bronson wasn't doing Westerns anymore. Clint wasn't doing Westerns anymore, right? I think unfairly so, Bronson kind of gets compared to Clint a lot because their career trajectory is, Clint is higher up, obviously, but they very similar kind of roles, very similar kind of actors, I think. And I love the original Death Wish, and I thought the remake was well done, especially for the time and age, like the year that it came out of. Like that was, vigilante justice. Like that was like, it's like, I was sitting there thinking, I'm surprised they made this movie, just considering the political climate at the time. I mean, it hasn't changed a ton, but in the 70s, you mentioned just how bad New York was. There was definitely a vibe from what I've read. I obviously wasn't alive at the time. Like, I hope somebody would just come in and just like clean up the streets type thing. Like there was, people were fed up, and then, Charles Bronson comes around and starts blasting the bad guys and taking matters into his own hands. There's a part of us that relates to that. I see it I see stuff on the streets all the time. And it's like, oh my God, I wish somebody would just come and clean this all up. And I know obviously we can't have it that way, but Eli Roth is an interesting director. I was surprised that he was able to pull off Death Wish as well as he did, because me being a horror fan, that's typically what Eli Roth is known for, is horror films. Some of the stuff is hit and miss for me, like Hostel was a big hit. I wasn't a huge fan of Hostel. I thought Cabin Fever was a lot of fun, but it cribbed a lot of stuff from other films, which is, I'm not a huge fan of like basically just people stealing stuff from other films and then like repackaging it into their own. You know, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody in particular, Tarantino, but you know, that's for another story. That's for another podcast.
Well, I think you hit on something with the Death Wish from the 70s, in that it is totally a power fantasy, you know, for the viewer who is, you know, was fed up with punks getting away with stuff, and the cops either being unable, unwilling, whatever, however you choose to see it. You know, the system is keeping them from handling it, the staffing, the laziness, whatever your particular political persuasion is, probably is how you choose to lay the excuse out there for why they're not handling it. But, the other, you know, there's some politics involved there too, though, because like you mentioned, Steve, you know, here's a very peaceful, liberal minded individual who has a very ugly reality, you know, visited upon him, and he responds by, you know, taking action and being violent. And I think it came at a time in our country where, as periodically happens, you know, masculinity was being redefined or challenged, or both. And this, you know, was kind of an assertion of traditional masculinity. Like, I felt like the subtext of that movie was, yeah, it's all fine and good. You can be a softy, you know, kind of laid back dude and have liberal ideas until somebody messes with you. And then you better be able to turn on the old style caveman, you know, thumpity thump and dish it out. Whether that's good or not, that's up to you, whatever your politics are. But I do think that was part of it. Now, I haven't seen the remake that you're talking about. I do think Bruce Willis is an underrated actor. When he applies himself, you know, I mean, there's been a few films where he's kind of phoned it in. But just ask Kevin Smith. But you know, the guy being a director of horror, I think that's interesting, because, you know, what do you do in horror? You're creating and maintaining suspense, and then, you know, providing release periodically to that suspense, in a very amped up way, more so than most other types of film. And if he could bring that, you know, or if he did bring that sensibility to this, you know, this story arc, I think it could work really well. I remember seeing it when it came out, that, hey, that'd be interesting. And then for some reason, I never got around to watching it. And I'm going to have to give it a try now based on your recommendation, Steve.
The thing that I find interesting, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, putting on your cop hat, Frank, is, so you weren't a cop. I'm 2018. That's towards or were you already retired by that point? So you were a cop sort of in between those two periods, the 70s and then the later teens, early 20s. I think that the detective in both stories, but particularly in the 1974 story, Ochoa, he was really the antagonist in the movie, but I think that he really portrayed the multidimensionness of what a cop probably feels. Yeah, the cop likes that the criminal who did these heinous acts are getting their comeuppance, but you're also you're the line between the chaos and the controlled chaos, essentially, of society. And you have somebody like Ochoa, he can't say that, oh, well, I'm just going to let this guy go. Eventually he does. Spoiler alert on a 50-year-old movie. But the fact of the matter that he has to go after Charles Bronson because his vigilantism is just as criminal as the criminal acts that what we might say in air quotes, the bad guys were doing. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah. It's interesting to look at the psychology of that. I wrote a book called The Last Horseman that has a group of 4 former cops who are fed files of really bad people who slipped through the system due to a technicality, and they visit a little justice on those people. And the story, it's been going on for a while, and the story picks up when they're down to only two, and one of them has decided he's done. And so that just leaves Sandy Banks and making him the last horseman. And before he can quit, some stuff starts going sideways. But there's a scene in there where a couple of FBI agents who are working on this vigilante case that's going on, they had this exact conversation that you're talking about that probably Ochoa was having internally. They, take two opposite sides of it and kind of argue it out. And they use the subway guy, Bernard Goetz, as a example to kind of put a name to it as they're discussing it. But they bounce back and forth the idea that, hey, the law is the law. He's taken, he's breaking the law. And if everybody did that, there'd be chaos. And then the other guy's arguing, yeah, but these guys, we can't get to them, and the cops can't get to them. And, they bounce it back and forth. And so it was a fun scene to write because I'm able to, explore both sides of that equation. Because I will tell you, and I'm just speaking for myself, I would guess that my sentiment is shared by some police officers out there, but I wouldn't speak for anyone other than myself. If you asked me, what should you do if somebody tries to rob you? I would tell you it's, no amount of money is worth your life or your safety. Don't, if you're not in a position to run, then, and all they want is the money, then give it to them. It's just money. And that's good advice. And I believe that. And I stand by that. At the same time, if I showed up on a scene and I walked up and said, hey, Chris, what happened? And you said, well, this guy tried to take my wallet and I kicked the Jesus out of him, and he's unconscious right here. And you can arrest him if you want to. I'd be thinking, hey, good on you, because this guy got, he's going to get paid back twice for being a jerk, right? He's going to get his melon thumped and he's going to go to jail. And so there's a little dissonance there, isn't there, between those two thoughts? Because, it seems inconsistent. The reality is the smart thing to do is to not engage in conflict unless you can't avoid it. But there's a certain amount of respect that I think everybody has for somebody who takes care of business, and everybody likes to see somebody that deserves it get their comeuppance. So that's why I think this was such a popular movie and spawned 72 sequels or whatever it was. And obviously it was worth a remake.
Yeah, I definitely suggest people go and read Frank's The Last Horseman. It's a great novel. I think too, that, maybe that you could say in that situation of the mugger, yeah, you should. And I 100% agree. If you can de-escalate and just cough up the money, but then, there is that element of self-defense. Whereas Paul Kersey, there's no self-defense there. He's going out just punks, and I think that that's probably the difference. As bad as the system was in New York City at that time period, the law and order side of me. Yeah. I'm a human being, and I want to, like you said, I want to see people get their comeuppance, but it's also, we live in a society that has rules. And even if the rules are terrible, you or me or, anybody else just going out there and taking out the trash, so to speak, is not going to make for a better society. We need to have the institutions that are supposed to be doing their jobs, reform and do their jobs. That's the will of the people. And I think that is the thing that first movie, and I think the second movie, the remake, does capture that discussion that I think we all have to some degree. But getting to horror, let's dive into the deep end of the horror pit. And so, Chris, you made this case for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I have to say, horror is a genre that I dip in and out of, but it's not really one of my go-tos. But I felt that the new one, the filming of it made it, the cinematography of it being crisper made me a bit more engaged with the remake than the 1970s version. What did you think about that?
Yeah, it is actually beautifully shot. It's one of the things that really enjoy about the film. The guy who directed Marcus Nispel, he came from like a music video background. So you see it all over the film in terms of like the quick cutting and like the sweeping shots, and which is like totally different than the original film. Which the original film was just not that at all. It was basically guys with like 16 millimeter cameras, just I don't know, just like static shots, right? So this one's like, it's super highly stylish. I don't know, have you seen it, Frank?
I have not seen either the original nor the remake. And I would say horror is probably right after Hallmark romance on my list of movies genres, or right before, rather. It ranks above that. I've seen a few of the classics, but I just I don't dig it that much, and my wife hates it, so I watch it even less now. Last decade and a half. So all I can say is you're probably right about everything you say, because I have no frame of reference.
I prefer it over the original, to be honest with you. Like I don't mind the original. Like I like it. The original is a classic, and I'll watch it once in a while. But I find myself going to the 2003 version much more often, just because of, as Steve pointed out, like it's more stylishly shot. You know, it's got a little like the gore is fantastic, like the practical effects. It's like probably the most famous shot in the film is like they pick up this hitchhiker, and then which is what happens in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but they like put a twist on it, and like the hitchhiker like pulls out a gun and like, you know, shoots herself in the head, and I like thinking like, sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, but like the body stays in that car, it seems like, for like another half an hour, and they're trying to get rid of the body, but they just can't seem to be able to get rid of this body. And then like this is where like you see Lee Ermey's character comes in, and he's like playing like the pretend sheriff of this town that's been abandoned. The only people that are living there is his family, and he's like, I don't know, like wrapping the body up in like I'm trying to saran wrap or what have you, and he's just like making these crude jokes the entire time, and like they're like, oh yeah, he's like, help me put it in the trunk or whatever, and it's just like just the way like Lee Ermey like plays the role, it's he's so good at it. It's like this just gross, disgusting guy who's like, and you can tell he's having the time of his life, and he's just like cracking. Apparently they didn't even really have a script for him. They're like, we just kind of want you to do this type of thing, and you just go do what you want to do. So a lot of like the dialogue is just him just being himself, apparently, which is terrifying to think about.
That guy has had such an eclectic career. I mean, just think about it. In 3 films, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the remake that you just talked about, which I didn't even know he was in that. We talked about 7 a while back. And he played the captain in there, and he was just outstanding. Police captain in New York sort of city, for that, you know, noir slash horror. But then he played the coach in, rescuing, Silverman, you know, or saving Silverman rather. The movie with, do you guys remember that movie with Jack Black? And yeah, I mean, and, you know, he was a ridiculous character, you know, he was totally ridiculous. So, you know, and then he was the drill sergeant in Full Metal Jacket. I guess you could add that one in there too, for the 4 corners. What a diverse, you know, I mean, you could say just be yourself. Well, that's a pretty wide range of being yourself. Those kinds of different characters.
Yeah, and he really was himself in all of those movies, as diverse as it is. I mean, that really is an amazing arc there. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
One thing they also did very good in this 2003 remake is usually in horror, the teenage actors or whatever, they're never teenagers, but like the actors and the actresses are not very good. And this one, they're very good. Like Jason Zucker's in it, Jessica Biel's in it, Lee Ermey's in it, like there's some really half decent actors in these roles, and they play their parts like really well. So that's, I think, is what kind of kicked it up a notch. In my opinion, like I said, this was like a string of remakes that came out in and around this time too. Like they remade, oh man, I'm trying to, Amityville Horror with Ryan Reynolds was in it. There was, that one was terrible. Like I don't know, people really like his acting. I, for the life of me, do not understand it. But like I don't know, he was in that movie and it was like, I just broke out laughing in some of the scenes because they were just really bad. The Friday the 13th one was pretty good. That was also done by the same director. The Nightmare on Elm Street, I pretty much could put a kibosh on those string of like remaking like 80s, late 70s horror films, because it was just, it did well at the box office, but it was just so not well received by like fans and critics. It basically, that's what killed it, and then they stopped remaking them. But like that was the pinnacle. And then they also did like a prequel to this film that was based off the 2003 remake, the Texas Chainsaw, The Beginning, which is also really well done. Lee Ermey has like more screen time in that movie, and he like kicks it up even further than this one. But like, if you're a fan of his acting, like even if you don't like horror, just to kind of watch him in these two films, or I guess.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I kind of doubt I'll do that. I just my distaste for horror has gotten stronger over the years. It's I think suspenseful horror like Seven and, you know, like Silence of the Lambs. We talked about both of those movies and how there are horror elements to it. I like that quite a bit. But straight up horror, it's not my thing anymore. My dad loves it. He watches it, and my mom watch it, you know. And in fact, I'll tell you a quick story. You'll appreciate that, Chris, being a horror fan. Way back when The Ring first came out, they got it on videotape, so it'd been out for a little while or whatever. And they watched it, and it totally freaked them out, like it does everybody. I mean, it's a well done, get in your head, you know, mess with your reality sort of movie. And so they watched it, and then they turned off the TV, and they got up and they went to bed, and they were laying in there kind of talking and you know, about the movie or whatever. And then all of a sudden, the TV goes on and the movie starts again.
Oh,
and they were freaked the heck out. And what had happened was they turned off the TV, but you know, they've got an old system where it's all components. It's not together really. And, he didn't, he didn't stop the VCR. He just hit the TV button. So the VCR played to the end, which takes a little while because there's all the stuff at the end. And then it rewound. And then when I got to the end of the rewound, it auto played. And because it was connected to the TV, it was interconnected enough that when play got hit, it popped on the TV. So it was just it totally freaked him out. So, one more reason I don't watch horror movies. I can freak myself out enough. I don't need help.
It's funny you bring up The Ring. I could have done that one because that was a remake of a Japanese movie,
Sure.
Ring U.
Sure.
And
we could have done The Departed too. I mean, that was a remake, right?
Yeah. And the American version with the first one, the second one, do not watch. It's terrible. The first one was, that was really good horror. That like I remember when that came out, like, everyone was terrified of that movie.
I didn't answer the phone for a week.
I've been watching a show that's just came out on MGM Plus called From. It's a Canadian production and it's horror. And like I'm probably in pretty close to Frank's horror fandom, but this I think is horror. It's the horror aspect is a very lightly used spice in it. What the horror element that comes through is that it keeps you on tension level 10 out of 10 the entire time. And then that little bit of horror that they throw in, that spikes it to 15. And then it brings you back down to that high level of tension. And I think that that's what I like about horror more so than just like constant blood and guts and gore. And that sort of stuff, because it becomes dated if you watch it again, or you have to really appreciate the genre, which I, say what you like about me. I really don't like the genre, but I do like that aspect of being brought through that emotional level of tension that some horror can bring you through.
Yeah, I used to like it more, for sure. I used to like it more, for sure. I mean, Evil Dead, the original, I saw it on videotape, and it scared the daylights out of me. And I read Stephen King, and even the ones that are horror, because he doesn't write only horror anymore, but even his police procedurals have a supernatural sense to it. I mean, I started watching the TV show, the series they made from the Mr. Mercedes from the Detective Hodges books there, and that definitely has some horror in it. So I'm not completely adverse to it, but you have to admit, Chris, that Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like if on the spectrum of horror, it's not a 3, it's a 7 at least, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I find as I get older, the kind of the gory stuff, I'm not liking as much as I used to when I was younger. Like, I'll still watch it, but it's not, I don't know, like I can't just watch like gory movies for the sake of gory movies. Like I used, like when I was like growing up as a teenager, I'd be like, oh man, this is so cool. And be like, no, maybe it's because I'm a dad now. I don't know. I just can't. Like I find I'm slowly kind of growing out of that. But I mean, horror is always going to be so close to my heart. Like I grew up watching this stuff. I love it. I still watch horror. Most of the movies I end up wanting to do, or they might not be horror per se, but they definitely have like horror elements to them.
Well, so I want to thank everybody for joining us for our favorite remakes. And I know everybody probably has an opinion on our remakes, and they have their own remakes. So if you have your own ideas for your very most favorite remakes, definitely leave it in the comments, email us, comment on social media, and then tune in next time for our least favorite remakes, because I think that will bring as much emotion to the game, maybe even more so than our favorites. So I'm signing off for Frank and Chris. Thank you guys for all coming together for this, and catch us on the next episode.